Hello, everyone. Welcome to this limited podcast series sponsored by iSight, maker of software solutions for case management, incident reporting, and other corporate compliance needs. I'm Matt Kelly, editor of the Radical Compliance newsletter, and I'll host for this series. The purpose of these podcasts is to hear from various thought leaders and professionals in the corporate compliance and ethics world, to talk about the challenges they face in running a corporate compliance program and the solutions they're finding to overcome these obstacles. Our first guest is going to be Shannon Walker. She is president of Whistleblower Security. That is a technology company based in Vancouver that helps companies achieve a stronger culture of internal reporting. Shannon herself has been a longtime thinker about issues around whistleblowing, developing an ethical corporate culture, how to stamp out abusive practices such as retaliation against whistleblowers. So we've got a lot that we can cover here. Shannon, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Matt. Looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Well, I suppose my first question is simply this. What role do you see whistleblower protection playing in cultivating a bigger and broader speak up culture for corporate organizations?
Well, I think first and foremost, if you're going to, endeavor to encourage and nurture a culture of speak up, you have to provide a very safe place for those people, those individuals to speak up. So unless people feel that they are going to be protected, that they are going to be safe, that their confidentiality and maybe their anonymity are going to be protected, you're not going to have the types of reporting that perhaps that you would want. I think the protections have to be kind of reiterated through the corporate policies and the codes of conduct, but they also have to be kind of reiterated and reinforced by the corporate vernacular and corporate leadership. If you have a policy that states one thing, but management's not in alignment with what the policy is espousing, then you're not going to have that type of environment where people are going to feel comfortable to speak up. And I certainly think that, with the increasing legislative and regulatory environment and more of these types of mandates and protections being put into place, it's becoming more commonplace for organizations and people and employees to feel more comfortable about the whole process of whistleblowing. I think years ago when I started this business, whistleblowing still had a stigma surrounding it. And as it becomes more and more commonplace and that, organizations like the SEC are putting these protections into place, it really is creating an environment where standing up and speaking up is actually encouraged and maybe applauded.
Mm-hmm. But now let me ask a follow-up question, I guess, is what are companies getting wrong here? Because employees will still cite, and plenty of surveys back this up, that the top reason they don't speak up is fear of retaliation. So, what is the hurdle that we're not overcoming here? And why are we not overcoming it?
Well, I do think, there is a paradigm shift happening, but I do think there's sort of this, this lag behind. And whereby maybe in the past, people who did speak up were seen as troublemakers or instigators, as opposed to being, again, celebrated as someone who's being brave enough to speak up and protect their organization plus their fellow colleagues. So I think that there's this misalignment sometimes between corporate values and doing the right thing. And sometimes corporate values can be misperceived as to be keep your mouth shut and get your job done and meet your quota, as opposed to really standing up and saying, you know what, I'm not going to just stand up or sit down and do the wrong thing. And so I do think it's a process of education, it's a process of training, it's a process of leading by example. And so if organizations have seen other people speak up in the past and be retaliated against or be demoted or left out or what have you, then again, there's a sort of a corporate hangover that we have to kind of work through. And I think sometimes, especially before companies put a whistleblower policy in place or a helpline in place, there needs to be that kind of cultural assessment so that you can go in and let's do a benchmark and see how people are feeling. I think that sometimes if there's been issues in the past and people don't see outcomes or resolution to those issues, then there's a sense of cynicism. And so the most important thing before setting up a helpline or any kind of code of ethics is to ensure you deal with corporate historical malfeasance or issues so that you sort of set a new foundation. And once you set a new foundation and start to put those training and tools and open door policies, et cetera, then you can start to, I think, really discourage anti-retaliation. I think the other thing I would say too is that so often we see anti-retaliation policies that are so beset in legalese. And so for your average employee, they need to read something, they need to digest something that's very, in a lay person's term. And I think I did, Matt, I looked at your LinkedIn and you had the GIF posts for
Yep.
anti-corruption. And I thought that was excellent because it was so relatable. And I think sometimes people need relatable concepts. And, if you're a sales guy trying to meet his quotas, and you don't really understand what the potential, bad behavior can, if you did engage in a bribe, what that actually means. I think there's a lot lost in translation. So I would say more relatable anti-retaliation policies and sharing sanitized cases. I think that's a really good example. And even in your GIF example on LinkedIn, it gave an actual example of how things went astray. And I think
Mhm.
those are really important learnable lessons that people can digest and understand.
Let me ask a bit about what you have seen over the years, because you've been working in whistleblowing and speak up cultures since 2005-ish or so, nearly 20 years, I think. Well, how have you seen those attitudes change? And I'm especially interested in regions not North America. Like in Europe, they're very sensitive to privacy concerns, and they're much less enamored of the idea that we should just speak up whenever we see something wrong. They would say it's a lot more complex. There's definitely not a history of encouraging whistleblowers in places, say in Asia or in Africa. But to your point that you made earlier, we're seeing an awful lot of whistleblower statutes crop up around the world. So are we there yet? Are we close to there yet? Do we know what there yet actually means? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Are we there yet? I don't think we are there yet, but I will say, watching the EU directive come into play and watching countries change the specifications around what you can report and whether you can be anonymous making those reports, it's moving in the direction whereby they're encouraging, allowing people to remain anonymous when filing whistleblower reports. And 5 years ago, that wasn't the case in some countries. When you talk about Latin America, it's so interesting because that is a culture that is much more engaged and much more. They feel the need to speak up. When we look at the volumes that come through our Latin American hotlines in Brazil, in Chile, in Colombia, they are so more well used. The cases are much more verbose. There's much more
Mm.
detail, and they're often on the phone for a long time. They are a culture that is like, yes, we're going to use the hotline and we're going to call. In Asia, it's a harder climate to encourage these types of calls because again, culturally, they don't speak up. In Japan, our hotline again is very underutilized, and so those are those cultural nuances I think that you have to consider when you are rolling out these programs. And so taking the time to ensure that your management teams on the ground in Asia are actually reinforcing management's wish that people do speak up if they feel the need to. And I think that's more of a long-term, another paradigm shift for those particular areas. I will say in North America, the US is a really mature market, whereby you've got some regulations and you've got some protections in place. In comparative, Canada is way far behind the United States and the EU for that matter. We don't have the whistleblower protections for private employees, even for federal employees, like the US does and even like the EU does. So it's a very fluid, I think, environment right now. And I think the US has done a great job in leading the charge on creating the initial whistleblower rules and regulations and protections. And the EU is finally coming into sort of a more mature place.
So let me switch gears a bit to ask also about case management in investigations, because it does strike me that above all, employees, like, they want to feel heard when they bring something. And so that means the company is actually listening to the complaint and doing something with it, not just giving them an easy submission channel and then your complaint goes off into the ether forever.
Yes.
So what do you see for progress on good case management or good practices around companies actually listening to these complaints, responding to them, and showing people, yes, we have heard you?
Well, I think the most important thing is when a complaint comes in, that the company acknowledges it as quickly as they possibly can. Because what we find is when someone finally has the courage to speak up, and it takes a lot of courage, it's a very scary thing, regardless of what the issue is. But to put yourself in that position, even if you're being confidential, is putting yourself at risk still. And so I think that they need initial validation that the company has looked at it, acknowledges receipt of it. And then, as the investigation continues, we might not be able to know the specifics of the investigation or even the outcomes. But the more the company can do to be transparent with the reporter, I think it gives more credibility and just sort of validation to the whole program in itself. And I know we have a couple clients who are very good about, they have a monthly newsletter, and then the back page of the monthly newsletter, they share sanitized cases. And it almost becomes, it's like the water cooler chit chat, because everyone comes together to talk about how ridiculous the case was, and can you believe that that person did that? And it's, again, another lesson to learn about what constitutes an ethical violation within that organization and what the potential outcomes are. So again, you're always trying to reinforce behavior, both on the reporting side, but then on adherence to the code of conduct or the code of ethics or the code of anti-retaliation as well.
It does strike me that an important quality to have on the company's side is just consistency in what your process is and how you handle it, so that employees will understand, once I put this in motion, these next things happen, and I can trust that process. Even if I don't necessarily like the answer because I was wrong or I misunderstand what's going on. I don't know what it might be, but I was wondering if you could talk just a bit more about that importance of consistency in what your whole end-to-end process is, from when they submit something to when they hear how it was resolved.
That is something that we always encourage our clients to do as well, is so that when a report comes in, the initial master vetter, master reviewer of that report knows how it's going to get triaged. So based on whatever the allegation may be, financial or human resources or health and safety, what the next processes are and who the next people who are going to be involved in that investigation. And so it can get triaged to the appropriate party for investigation with the appropriate feedback to the reporter. And also again, letting them know that they may not know the ultimate outcome. And again, I think one of the important things too is to encourage people to speak up, even if they don't have the evidence, even if they don't have direct knowledge of what the issue could be, but just that they know something, maybe they feel something is awry. They should still feel free to come forward and still feel that they'll be supported and come forward in coming forward, because you're not always, especially as a colleague of someone who may be doing something wrong, you're not going to have the evidence or all of the initial information that someone needs for an investigation. But at least if there's red flags, you're doing your due diligence by reporting it and allowing the managers and the investigators to take a more serious look at what's going on. But to your point, I do think it's really important to have the full life cycle covered and ensure that, again, through the platform that you're using, you post something that says, thank you, this issue has been closed. We value your input. We can't let you know what happened or what have you.
So last question I wanted to sneak in here was, I see that I think you have a webinar, something about compliance and ethics in the sports world. What's that about?
Well, that's with a group up here in Canada called ITP Sport and Recreation. And they are an agency that's really designed to have independent prevention and complaint management training for sports organizations and associations. And given the last couple of years, with all of the horrendous reporting that we've seen through the gymnastics and Hockey Canada and baseball, et cetera, we're going to talk about the impact for victims who don't have the, they don't have the availability of a helpline. They have nowhere to go. What can we do to help them? And what can we do to help protect organizations? Because especially with the amateur sports associations, not only are their young athletes at risk, but their funding, their volunteers, their fundraising, all of this is at risk if they're not doing the proper thing to protect their athletes and their administrators. So we're going to talk a little bit about, what the risks are to the organization, how they can better handle complaints internally, and how we can support them using the various tools that we have available right now.
All right. Well, Shannon, that's all the time we have today, but you covered plenty of ground for us, gave us a lot to think about. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Matt. It was lovely to meet you. Lovely to have this conversation. Appreciate it.
Again, everybody, that was Shannon Walker, President of Whistleblower Security, joining us to talk about current challenges she sees in developing a strong speak up culture. That is all for this podcast. I'm your host, Matt Kelly, editor of Radical Compliance. Thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you to iSight for sponsoring this podcast series, and I hope you'll join us again next time.